Hello, good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joe Lopez. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications for the Richard Nixon Foundation. I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the C-SPAN audience that's also watching this program tonight. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to recognize a few individuals in the audience, starting with Nixon Foundation board member and president of Chapman University, Dr. Daniele Strupa. Dr. Strupa. Tamara Martin is the director of the Nixon Library for the National Archives. Thank you for being here, Tamara. And Lori Cox-Hahn, the Doy B. Henley Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University. I also want to thank all of the Nixon Foundation members that are here in the audience tonight, especially Mike Crow. He and his wife, Vicki, are longtime members of the Nixon Foundation. Thank you for being here. Members since 1990, so thank you, Mike. We cannot host programs like the one here tonight without support from our members and our great supporters. So if you are not a member of the Nixon Foundation, you can get more information in the gift shop on your way out. And the gift shop is also a way to support the Nixon Library and Foundation. All profits and proceeds from the gift shop go back to the Nixon Foundation. And we're about 100 days out from Christmas, so it's a great time to start your Christmas shopping here tonight. Pick up Luke's book and get a few t-shirts and coffee mugs and start your shopping there. So Dr. Luke Nichter is a professor of history and the James H. Kavanaugh Endowed Chair in Presidential Studies at Chapman University, and an expert on the long 60s, time period from the beginning of the John F. Kennedy administration through the end of the Richard Nixon administration. He's a New York Times bestselling author or editor of 8 books, including the one he's going to talk about here tonight, The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. In a recent review for the Wall Street Journal, columnist Barton Swaim called the book, quote, a delightful demolition of the many political myths that continue to muddy our understanding of that election year, 1968. The book is going to be available here tonight in the gift shop, and Luke will stick around to sign copies for you tonight. Luke will be interviewed tonight by Jim Byron. He's the president and CEO of the Richard Nixon Foundation. I want to welcome Jim and Luke up to the stage now. Take it away.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Nixon Library. Luke, welcome back.
Thanks.
I want to start tonight by reading from the same Wall Street Journal review that my colleague Joe Lopez just did. Barton Swaim, this was reviewed on August 16th in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. The book, of course, is The Year That Broke Politics. He writes, Mr. Nichter's book stands out for its clear, direct prose and the scrupulous research on which it is based. The endnotes frequently cite archived letters and other primary sources. And that really is how you wrote this book, that it is based in the documents and in the research. And it's hard to top that. That was a terrific review in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. So Luke, before we jump into many of your key findings that you found from the archival research, you're very familiar with the Nixon White House tapes. You wrote 2 volumes with Douglas Brinkley called The Nixon Tapes. You've written a biography of Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr. Why now jump to 1968, and why write this book?
Well, first of all, thanks to the Nixon Library and the Foundation for hosting the event. It's such a great contingent from Chapman. Half my colleagues are sitting here in the front. And especially to the students. You have football to compete with here tonight, as well as tennis. So you have, if I were a student, I'd have other distractions probably. And especially it's special for me because my wife Jennifer and daughter Ava are here, so thank you for being here. I think for scholars especially, I'm going down the rabbit hole. And I ended up in a place I wasn't expecting to be. You kind of follow the evidence where it goes. And when I was researching the last book, this biography of Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., when I got to 1968, despite the number of books that have been written about the 60s, I don't know how many, I don't have the answer, hundreds, thousands, it just didn't seem like any were recent, had been deeply researched, and this has been a belief of mine for a long time. It doesn't make me popular at academic conferences to say this, but an awful lot of what passes for history is really not deeply researched. And I'm not ashamed to say that. So many history books, they cite the same stories, they have the same kinds of footnotes, and if you trace them back to the original source, oftentimes it vanishes like a mirage in a desert. And so I felt like it was time for a fresh look. There were a lot of new records out, tapes, diaries, personal papers, and I think that's really what, as you said, allowed me to come up with, while a subject familiar to many people, and many people here, I was born in the late 70s, but others here look older than me, who lived through and have memory of this era. I think just enough time had passed, 50 years, where I think that allows us to take a more dispassionate look at a subject that was really had a lot of high tempers in the end of that decade. A lot of new records have been opened, so I think it was time for a fresh look.
Well, another thing that sets this book apart is the number of people that you talked to as you were in the research phase. How many people did you talk to when you were writing this book?
I don't know the exact number. With the Lodge book, I was able to talk to every living person who had worked with him at some significant phase of his career, 53 in total. And there's a little overlap with this book. Only one would not talk to me, and that was his personal secretary in Saigon, who was there from the Diem coup all the way to the fall of Saigon. And the secretaries are some of the hardest ones ever to talk to because they're so loyal, they're not political, they don't have a personal stake in the events the same way the politicians do a lot of times. This book, there was a little overlap at about 85, so I think it's the first book to have cooperation from all four of the major sides. So that's then outgoing President Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who becomes the Democratic nominee later that year. As we knew him then, the former vice president, Richard Nixon, and the then former and future governor of Alabama, George Wallace. And I think I talked to all of the kids, I mean, they're not kids anymore, and about 85 staffers in all, so I think pretty much everybody who was still around. And I was surprised by how many were around, and the vast majority were actually pretty eager that someone cared and wanted to talk to them, because a number of them had said they'd either never spoken to anyone or had stories to tell that they'd never told before.
Well, for the record, there are 76 pages of footnotes in this book. So it's a little over 300 pages, so it just shows you, again, the extent of the research that Luke did. So with that as the foundation for our talk tonight, let's jump into the first of perhaps your most significant conclusions. I'd say there's two real significant conclusions. The first has to do with what is called the Chenault Affair. Who was Anna Chenault? Because you actually met her and you were the last person to interview her.
Yeah, so if in recent years, the last 5 or 10 years, if people know much of anything about the 1968 election, it's that Nixon used Washington socialite Anna Chenault as a sort of a go-between or as a messenger to send a message to then South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu to stay away from the Paris peace talks that were going on. The U.S. at the time was trying to negotiate a withdrawal of American forces. The war was deeply unpopular by 1968 for many people. 68 and 69 are arguably the two worst years in terms of casualties, unrest in the country. The draft was tearing the nation apart at home, and 500,000 troops were stationed in Southeast Asia. And so the peace talks began in May, and so it's become known in history as the Chenault Affair. It's actually been on the public record for a long time, since early January of 1969. And the idea, in essence, is that Richard Nixon, to ensure that he won the election in 68, sent a message to the South Vietnamese through Anna Chenault as an intermediary, effectively saying that if you hold back from the peace talks now, that as president, I, Nixon, will give you a better deal at once. And so he used this as a technique to get into office. And, you know, it's been on the public record for a long time. This is something that I had learned, you know, in college and in grad school. And it's really the thing in recent years that people really know about the 1968 election. So I kind of assumed that it was either true or mostly true. And like other aspects of history that I'm talking about, it just didn't seem that anyone had really researched it the more that I looked in it. And you could look at any number of authors who've written about it in recent years, and they all have certain things in common. They really didn't seriously research it. They didn't talk to Anna Chenault when she was living. And she will tell you how little she really knew about all that's been alleged about her over the years. No one interviewed the South Vietnamese, and up until very recently, the ambassador to Washington, Boy Diem, was still alive and living in Rockville, Maryland, and was happy to talk to anyone doing research. Chew's personal assistant is still going strong today. I saw him outside of Chicago, outside of a Buddhist temple that he went to one day, drove over to Chicago and did that. No one had interviewed the remaining members of the Paris peace talks, who, if you did that, will verify that we weren't even negotiating peace. The only things that we were allowed to negotiate in our mandate in 1968 was that we would keep talking, that we would one day enter more serious talks, and ultimately only negotiated a bombing halt, another bombing halt, which took place right on the eve of the 1968 presidential election. So the further I got into it, as you see, it started to unravel. And all the certainty that's been written about, well, Nixon, you know that Nixon did this. It's firmly part of the conventional wisdom. Look, I can't prove a negative. I can't prove, perhaps more evidence will come out, just as came out for this book. I can't prove a negative that Nixon or Chenault, weren't interested in this idea or doing something. But as I say, if you add up and you weigh the evidence, certainly, and I'm not an attorney, but anyone kind of trying this case in court, I would argue that the available evidence doesn't really add up to much of anything at all.
Just let's dig a little bit deeper into that. You look at the negotiations that are going on in Paris. Again, this is Johnson as president. He has dispatched Avril Harriman and Clark Clifford, who was the defense secretary, and George Ball to essentially be the negotiators for the American side in 1968. And as you said, the only agreement was that they had to agree to keep talking. There was a great disagreement as to how to recognize the NLF, the Viet Cong. And so this, I think the hope was that this would manifest ultimately into an agreement that could become a peace deal, but take us through those negotiations in early to mid 1968.
Yeah, I think Lyndon Johnson understood that, the domestic side of his legacy, Great Society, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, he felt fairly comfortable about that side of his legacy as he went into retirement. He was concerned about Vietnam. And Vietnam, the nation was tearing itself apart. The Democratic Party was tearing itself apart. I mean, millions of Americans watched that on television from their living rooms at the convention in Chicago that year. And so understanding that was the weaker part of his legacy, I think Johnson became desperate to leave office, much like Nixon wanted to be known as a peacemaker. I think Johnson was either desperate to find peace in Vietnam by the end of his term, or at a minimum, if he couldn't do that, to leave his successor, whoever that might be, in a better situation than they might have been otherwise. And I think Johnson had, I learned from records that, this is my take in the book, that Johnson actually had very low expectations that peace was possible in 68. But I think he was convinced by those around him, some of whom you mentioned, that this is your last chance to be known as a peacemaker. And even if it fails, like every other initiative, the back of Johnson's memoirs, on the very back, kind of inside the boards of the books and the appendices, list all the peace initiatives that he tried beginning in 1965. I forget how many there were, but it was dozens. Some overt, some covert, using third countries, third parties to do it. And I think those around Johnson convinced him, this is your last chance. And even if it fails, why not try? What do you have to lose? But I think as the talks dragged on, and nothing was really accomplished in May of 68, June, July, August, September, I think Johnson came to believe that the talks themselves were being used by those who wanted to see Humphrey elected, the vice president. And the closer they got to the election, I think that really became the real purpose of those talks. And the papers of Avril Harriman, the writings of Clark Clifford, two of those that you mentioned, show clearly that Harriman at one point, I was shocked that someone would write this down and put it in their own papers. Harriman's at the Library of Congress. And he's writing this at a point in 68 where he's saying, over the years, I've tried to reflect on, I'm paraphrasing, but it's close to this, on what's more important than Vietnam. And I don't know very much that's more important than Vietnam at this point in our nation's history, but preventing Richard Nixon from reaching the White House is more important than Vietnam. And so you really see, this was recorded. I'm citing the records of those, who worked for Johnson. I don't think Lyndon Johnson knew about that. I think at a certain point, Johnson was no longer in control of his own staff. Because you have to think about it from their perspective. If you're a young staffer in Washington, you've got a nice lifestyle, you work within proximity of power, your kids go to a nice school, you live in a nice neighborhood. The last thing you want to do is go home and tell your wife, we got to move, and we don't know what's coming next, and we've got 6 weeks to move out of town. There's a great sense of inertia to sort of keep things going. And if you work for Johnson, you want to work for Humphrey, and you're going to get promoted probably, in the next Democratic administration. So I think a lot of that began driving the peace talks the closer it got to the election, and it really wasn't about peace, I don't think.
One of those who you mentioned, George Ball, actually went to go run Humphrey's campaign.
Humphrey was Ball had a brief stint as U.S. ambassador to the UN, and I think what he learned, he had been influential near the President Johnson and then Kennedy prior to him in the State Department. But I think he realized that once you go to New York, you have separation from power, and even though you come down weekly for meetings, you no longer have the president's ear the way that you used to. And so Ball, I think, became very unhappy. He was only ambassador to the UN for maybe a month or 6 weeks, and had dramatically resigned from that post to go become Hubert Humphrey's chief foreign affairs advisor during that campaign in the fall. So Johnson, one by one, was losing his staff. He resented every staff departure, especially when they went to work for a rival politician. And in this case, a lot of them were either moonlighting for Humphrey after hours at the White House, or they had dramatically resigned. And Johnson was not someone who would share a loyalty with anyone else. And so a lot of his closest people left and worked for Humphrey.
So this is happening May, June, July. These negotiations are going on, or at least talks, we'll say, are going on in Paris. So then on October 22nd, 1968, this is 3 weeks, maybe 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks before the election, there's a longtime DC insider whose name is Bryce Harlow. And Bryce Harlow had worked in the Eisenhower administration, and he writes a memo to Richard Nixon that President Johnson is about to order a bombing halt in regard to the bombing of North Vietnam. And this was a surprise to Nixon. One might call it an October surprise, because Nixon had been assured by LBJ that there would be no bombing halt unless the North Vietnamese had met 3 very clear preconditions. In fact, Nixon writes in his memoirs, quote, "I fired off a battery of orders. Have Mitchell check with Kissinger." John Mitchell, his campaign manager, and of course Henry Kissinger, who was an informal advisor to sometimes advisor to his campaign. Have Dirksen and Tower, 2 senators, blast the moves by the White House. Have Dirksen call Johnson and let him know that we were on to his plans. So Nixon is seeing this as essentially a retreat by Johnson from those 3 preconditions. Am I right?
Yeah, when I looked at that memo, by the way, the original, this is, historians, it's not like Indiana Jones. You're sitting in an archive and you're assembling. Archivists hate it when you say dusty records because there's not supposed to be any dust in an archive. But you're assembling records, like evidence, like pieces of a puzzle, except you can't cheat and look at the box and figure out what the puzzle's supposed to look like in advance. And you never get all the pieces. And you have to make a judgment before you have the evidence that you really want, when you write it up. And when that memo is actually the original, as far as I know, has never surfaced, which is interesting because it's actually quoted in Nixon's own memoirs, so it must have existed. But the way Nixon quotes it, there's a phrase in that memo that caught my eye, and it's Harlow warns Nixon not that LBJ is maneuvering in the way that you describe. The term of art that Harlow uses in the memo are the White Housers, and which I interpreted to mean the people around Johnson, but not necessarily Johnson himself. Johnson was harder to figure out what he really thought at any given point in time. And so Harlow had tipped Nixon off that really, as I say, people around Johnson might be trying to do whatever it takes to pull Humphrey across the finish line.
So in 2017, there are 4 pages of yellow pad notes that turned up right here at the Nixon Library that reflect the orders from Nixon that he's issuing through Haldeman after reading Harlow's memo. And Luke, you reprint in the appendix of The Year That Broke Politics all 4 pages in full. So you can read them for yourself. And then you dissect them line by line on pages 207 and 208 and 209 of the book. So what are the Haldeman notes, and how should they be interpreted as part of the Chenault Affair?
Yeah, this became a fascinating new piece in the puzzle. So the story's been on the public record largely since January of '69. St. Louis Globe-Dispatch published the first piece. Christian Science Monitor had a draft earlier, and they kind of gutted it and didn't run with it. So think about how long that's been on the public record, where even during Watergate, when seemingly, I used to say that President Nixon's been investigated more than any other politician. I think we might be, eventually we'll surpass that with Trump. Time will tell. But, you know, these records surfaced in maybe 6, 7 years ago, these pages of Haldeman notes. And they're still, the library is still opening new pages of Haldeman's notes. And these were cited in late 2016 as proof, you know, that Nixon did, you know, all that was alleged. And I had a different take even then in terms of some of this is open to interpretation. And I'm always clear, I say in my classroom to students all the time, go to the source. You know, you don't have to believe my interpretation. There's lots of this that reasonable people can debate, can disagree. You know, we can learn how to disagree without being disagreeable about some of this when it's political, which I think as a nation we've lost how to do. But go look at the source, and it's why I reproduced the notes in the back of the book, because this was late 2016. I'll remind you what was going on in late 2016. Trump had been elected, I think, by a surprise. I think he was surprised that he'd won, from what I can tell. I was in Vietnam doing research for the last book and ultimately for this book for most of that month, and I expected to come back to President-elect Hillary Clinton, probably like most Americans, in late 2016. And these pages surfaced, and they became a vehicle that people seized on. I would argue that they really didn't care about Nixon or Thieu or Vietnam. As allegations of Trump and Russia collusion started almost within days of that election, these notes, I argue, became a vehicle to see how Nixon did it before Trump, how to conspire with a foreign power in order to steal an election. Otherwise, I don't think there was much in there really new about Nixon or Vietnam. So I think that's the first way I interpret them. The second part of your question, the Haldeman notes are a great resource for archivists. Some of them have been published. There's a Haldeman Diaries book. There's a multimedia version that was done by Sony. Imagine Nixon's chief of staff. So we already have 3,400 hours of tapes of Nixon. And now in addition, we have almost a running play-by-play every day when his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, has a meeting with Nixon. He's keeping almost a second, almost verbatim record sometimes of what's going on. So these were cited, and someone would cite these records and say, this is proof that Nixon and Chenault were doing this in '68. But you have to understand these records. You know, sometimes a tape or a diary, you know, especially a tape, we think somehow it's a more valuable kind of evidence because we heard it ourselves. So it must be true. That's not always what these are. You know, in the case of the Haldeman notes, sometimes they are more of a diary. They're not really, I mean, they're not, you know, so we have Haldeman records a lot of times for meetings that were also taped. So you can actually listen to a Nixon tape and then compare it to what Haldeman's writing during the same meeting. And the Haldeman diaries are not really a verbatim record of a meeting. It might be, it's more like a running to-do list of things for his chief of staff to follow up on. And I would say they generally contain 4 things in the notes. They contain things that Nixon might have said. Sometimes there's verbatim material in the notes that's not quoted, not usually quoted in the notes. Sometimes it's things that Haldeman said, sometimes verbatim, but usually not in quotes either. Sometimes it's other things that other people say during meetings, and sometimes, because it's not on the tape, it must be things that just occurred to Haldeman, like it does to all of us. We're having a meeting about something else, we think of something, we jot it down, and we follow up later. And so it's very difficult to look at a page of these notes and say, see, Nixon said that. And that's how these were used in 2016, when people were very focused on proving Trump and Russia. I think it had nothing to do with Nixon or Thieu. This became a vehicle to show how, if you're a Republican president, how you steal an election.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because you write on page 209, read in full, they reveal Nixon, these notes, reveal Nixon trying to rally people toward Johnson's Vietnam position, not commit treason against it.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the notes, and again, the 4 pages are there, the originals are over here in the library. And I don't see any evidence that Nixon was trying to betray Johnson. I think Nixon was aware, because of the warning from Harlow about the White Housers, that people around Johnson were betraying Johnson. And I think what Nixon wanted to make sure is that Johnson hadn't softened his position on Vietnam, and wanted to make sure that Johnson's own people stuck to Johnson's conditions for peace, which ultimately they were trying to soften, I argue, because they wanted Humphrey to win.
Let's talk about the Vietnamese side here, because no account of this can be complete without considering what was going on in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese were essentially facing the prospect of being forced to agree to the outcomes that the Johnson Whitehousers were negotiating with their arch enemies, the North Vietnamese. President Tu certainly had his own political reasons not to get involved in these talks in Paris or not to attend. So let me ask you, did the South Vietnamese government need any prodding from Anna Chenault or from anyone to be swayed to reject any of these terms from that were being discussed in Paris?
Well, I mean, this is another case where I just think previous authors really hadn't researched it. They hadn't talked to the South Vietnamese. I mean, if you take the elements of the Chenault Affair, the most basic elements, and if you break it apart and then you can test the individual components, sort of links, like links in a chain. We're talking about an American communication to the South Vietnamese that might have been authored or approved by Richard Nixon and transmitted through Anna Chenault, that then the South Vietnamese received, and if we are to believe it, changed their mind about going to the peace talks. And those are the basic elements of the Chenault Affair. So you can test them kind of in isolation and see if they work. And to this date, no evidence of what was the message that was transmitted. There is no evidence of a message. What did the South Vietnamese receive on their side? Nothing has shown up in the archives in Ho Chi Minh City. And the living officials say there was no transmission of any message. And if there was, we didn't need to be told not to participate in the selling out of our own country, as they saw it at the time. Anna Chenault knew surprisingly little about this. The South Vietnamese didn't know anything about it. And it's surprising how many other authors have actually referred to the Nixon sabotaged a peace initiative. Some have said a peace agreement at times. And talking to even the assistant of Harriman in Paris, Dan Davidson, who died a couple years ago, I asked him, I said, was there ever a peace agreement in 1968? He said, absolutely not. And Harriman is definitely not on the same side of the political aisle as Richard Nixon, I should be clear. And Davidson said something like, and even if there was, we would have never written it down because we would have needed sort of room to maneuver during negotiations. So like I said, if you begin to look at it, I remember John Negroponte said, when the the United States begins diplomatic negotiations with another country, I think he called it a circular 180. It was kind of an all stations message that went worldwide to all of our embassies and consulates, announcing them the beginning of formal negotiations with another country about something, which is what the negotiations were. It was the United States and North Vietnam at the time with Hanoi. And he said there was no circular 180. There were no negotiations. This was just sort of informal talks. They became more formal during the Nixon years. In '68, Saigon, an essential element to peace, obviously, in South Vietnam, was not even part of the talks. And people miss that detail, that somehow Saigon, by staying out or withdrawing from the talks, they suggest that they had committed to something they were pulling back on because of Richard Nixon in '68. They were not even part of the talks up to that point. The whole point was to establish the conditions that they would join the talks, which they did later, under the Nixon phase of the talks. So again, you look at it under a microscope, and this whole story really begins to unravel quickly.
And is this account, is this confirmed by your sources on the South Vietnamese side? Who did you talk to on the South Vietnamese side?
So Boy Diem was the ambassador, and he lived to be 90-something. He died a couple years ago. And Hoang Duc New is the Thieu's personal assistant and second cousin. He was kind of his note taker at a lot of his meetings in Saigon. And he said something that I think maybe is safe to say for the cameras. But he said people assumed that because we stayed out of the Johnson's peace talks, that somehow we were pro-Nixon. He said under the Nixon period, we were also under political pressure to act in a certain way according to American political timing. I mean, I think a strict reading of the peace agreement was we did abandon our ally after a certain point because it was more important to bring our POWs home, as President Nixon did, and bring our troops home and end the nation's longest war, which is what it was at the time, which was tearing the country apart at home. I think that was what we did. I think Nixon had no other option, during those first 4 years, no other option at all as a new president. And what Na said to me was, people don't understand. He said, we were never going to make a deal with Averell Harriman in 1968. He said, Averell Harriman treated South Vietnamese like plantation Negroes, was the term he used. And so there's no chance at all that this was going to happen.
Let's switch gears to LBJ, because I think that LBJ comes through in this book as just an absolutely fascinating character. He is, at the same time, he is calculating, he is strategizing, he is charming, he is considerate, he is scornful, he is cheerful, he is angry, he is selfless and self-centered, he is shrewd. Talk about who was Lyndon Johnson?
Lyndon Johnson was a masterful politician. He was every bit Richard Nixon's match on the Democratic side of the aisle. And if he had run in '68 against Nixon, that would have been the battle of the Titans. I mean, there would be no greater election in modern U.S. history. I mean, these were unparalleled, leaders of their parties who had similar political careers, who had sort of leapfrogged each other at different times. I mean, Nixon made it first to the vice presidency. Johnson made it first to the presidency. I mean, they were very competitive because they often faced each other on a ballot. And I think what they came to realize in '68 is not facing each other on the ballot anymore, that they actually had a lot in common. I think I remember Lucy Baines Johnson said, Johnson's youngest daughter, very different people, different politically, different approaches to policy and management. She's like, but it was call it rivals or shared enemies that brought them together ultimately by the end of their careers. Each were very aware they didn't go to prep school. Each were very aware they didn't go to the best colleges, Nixon to Whittier, Johnson to what's now Texas State in San Marcos. They both felt looked down upon by the elite, the national media, the establishment in both parties. And so I think they had these certain undercurrents between them that really drew them together kind of as human beings. And I think a second thing is I think Johnson understood that whoever his successor was, that presidency was going to be in large part a sequel to his own presidency. I think it's difficult to find a more modern administration where so much was left undone and contingent by the end. Not just the war, but you look at, this book causes me to look at even Nixon's domestic policy in a whole new light. This fairly progressive policy, EPA, Clean Air, Clean Water, Wilderness Act, a lot of the things that author Paul Carter talked about in his excellent new book on Tuesday. And obviously the size of government didn't shrink under Nixon, it grew. I mean, to the consternation of a lot of conservatives. You look at a lot of what Nixon achieved during the presidency, and the people that are often upset were conservatives, kind of Goldwater, old Taft, Republicans. And I wonder now, even looking at the Nixon president, I don't want to get ahead of myself because it's '68, Nixon's not president, pretend he's not, that in a way, a lot of those policies might have been pursued by President Nixon because there was one voter, on a ranch in Stonewall, Texas, who could play a very powerful force, restraining congressional Democrats against Nixon, acting as a cheerleader effectively. And as far as I can tell, Nixon never said a cross word about Johnson after this point. Johnson never did the same about Nixon. All of a sudden, this intense rivalry that lasted decades just sort of melted away in 1968.
Yeah, we're going to get more into that in just a minute, but I want to ask you about when LBJ decided to essentially end his political career. March 31, 1968, you describe in great detail the events, his considerations up to that point. You quote extensively from First Lady Bird Johnson's diaries. What was LBJ wrestling with as he tried to come to a firm conclusion, and what were his motivations?
It was a process. I think Johnson, like a lot of Americans in 1968, Johnson wasn't static. He was reacting to events as they unfolded that year. I mean, every month it seemed like had dramatic headlines. The year started with the Tet Offensive. Then it was the capture of a submarine by a ship by the North Koreans. Then it was, of course, the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Senator Kennedy. Johnson's own withdrawal from politics, the convention in Chicago for the Democrats in August. I mean, sort of every month had some unprecedented nature to the news. I think those who remember that probably would probably agree with that characterization. So I think Johnson, it was a process. What I found is that, one, Johnson's own personal health, played a much bigger role in the decision. The media wrote it up at the time because the speech that Johnson gave on TV on March 31st, it was largely a Vietnam speech that was a reaction to the Tet Offensive earlier that year. So the Tet Offensive was this sort of multi-city coordinated attack by our communist enemies in South Vietnam on a number of cities and American and South Vietnamese military installations, right at a time when Americans were told the war was going better. It didn't make sense how this attack were possible, that maybe it's not going better. And Walter Cronkite, I think, famously began to turn on the war at that point in his coverage in the nightly news. So Johnson's health, I think, was a much bigger factor. People assumed that because it was a Vietnam speech, and it was just after the Tet Offensive, that he must have stepped down because Vietnam wasn't going very well. When in fact, Lady Bird's diary and other new evidence suggests Johnson had planned as early as 1965, after winning in 1964, that he had the term that he finished of Kennedy's, 63 to 64, that he would have his additional term, but that he would not run for another term of office, just as his political hero Harry Truman had not run again in 1952. Johnson was always very aware of sort of historical precedent, especially within the Democratic Party. So I think he'd really labored over that decision a while. His own father had died at age 60. He understood Johnson men died young in the family. And as we know, Johnson came to have a very short post-presidency, dying only about 4 years later at age 64.
So I'd say the first of your major conclusions we've just discussed in detail regarding the Chenault Affair. The second has to do with the Johnson-Nixon relationship, because you write in the book that after LBJ decided on announced on March 31, 1968, that he wasn't going to run again, LBJ secretly favored Nixon to succeed him. Why would LBJ do this over his own vice president?
This is the most controversial argument in the book. So with the Chenault Affair, it was really just sort of showing that what's been said doesn't make a lot of sense. But this is really the newest aspect of the book, based on new evidence. And I'm careful about how I say it, but it's the most controversial part of the book is that I argue that it's the first book to argue that Johnson actually came to prefer Nixon. So a Democrat came to prefer a Republican. And I don't know it's because Johnson liked Nixon. That's really unknowable to me and maybe even irrelevant. But that Johnson came to see having Nixon as a successor was better for his own political legacy and place in future history. And so Lady Bird's diary, other evidence we'll get into. Billy Graham's diary was the first book to use Billy Graham's diary. He acted as a messenger between Johnson and Nixon. So it was a process.
First researcher to have looked at Billy Graham's diary. I mean, that is your holy grail of the research. And what did Billy Graham write in his diary?
Well, I mean, as I said, I was going down the rabbit hole, and I wish I could say I was so brilliant to have expected that I'd find this material. But Graham happened to die at age 99 in February of 2018, right in the middle of the research. And I wasn't expecting that. To step back a minute, I had a meeting in December of 2017 with former Vice President Walter Mondale in Minneapolis. And I was beginning to make trips to Minneapolis because Humphrey's papers are at the Minnesota Historical Society. A lot of the Humphrey faithful, are all still there in Minnesota. And so this was a trip. I was going to see Humphrey's son, Hubert III. I was going to see Don and Arvon Fraser, who met originally. They're legends in their own right in Minnesota politics. They met during Humphrey's 1948 Senate campaign, so longtime Humphrey observers. And then Walter Mondale, who seemingly seems like the biggest name of the group. But I was asking him about a period of his career that wasn't his vice presidency. It wasn't his presidential run in '84. And sometimes when you talk to a big figure about a period other than what they're known for, they really don't have much to say. So I didn't have high expectations. In '68, he was Senator Mondale. He had Humphrey's old Senate seat. He was co-chair of Humphrey's campaign in '68. But I know that that's often a ceremonial role and not always substantive in a campaign. But the part that surprised me, because he didn't write about this in his memoirs, was he said that Humphrey and I became very close in the 1970s. He helped me to negotiate the vice presidential duties with Carter, which I'm not aware that's on the public record. Almost like an MOU is the way he described it. And he said, Humphrey and I discussed '68 many times. And so I felt in a way like I was getting from Mondale what Humphrey really thought about some of the things that we're talking about. And he said, if you want to know what I think, Lyndon Johnson absolutely did not want Hubert Humphrey to win in 1968. That was a radical idea for me to hear from someone who is as close to Johnson and Humphrey, who probably was living at that time. And I really felt like if he's told me he discussed this with Humphrey many times, that must be what Humphrey thought at the same time too. And so I said, wait a second, what do you mean? Do you mean that Johnson wanted Nixon to win? And we were sitting at Mondale's law firm, kind of at the very end of a long conference room. And he kind of looked down, his gaze went down the other way, and he kind of came back to me, and he said, maybe. And that was as far as he was willing to go. And so I really felt that was a challenge to figure out what was Johnson doing. That just because Johnson withdrew from the ballot in March 31st, that was not a withdrawal from politics. He simply shifted his energies to his legacy and not running again. And then it was 2 months later that Graham died, and it gave me a chance to test what Mondale was saying. At the time, now you might be aware in Charlotte, there's the Billy Graham Library and Archive. They're still building it. It's a whole research facility. And Graham's death apparently triggered a beginning of a process that continues today, the opening of his 70 years of personal papers. I mean, it's vast. It's almost like a presidential library. And and so I was only allowed to see part of his personal papers. There's a part of his papers that he had diaries, that the records are called the VIP notebooks, is what he called it. Some parts of it he actually does call a diary. He uses that word. The Nixon part he calls the Nixon diary. And a lot of it's restricted, but because he lived to age 99, it's 52 volumes of diaries. I mean, imagine 52 books of diaries, because he's 99 when he died. And it begins in 1950 with Harry Truman and goes until 2014 with President Obama. And I would describe it as kind of a hybrid diary scrapbook. It documents contact, sometimes verbatim, with presidents, their families, and top staff that I've not seen at any presidential library or National Archives. It's a unique resource, almost like a counselor sort of pastoral relationship at times. Johnson even documents the content of the prayers at some point. I mean, really personal details about how these leaders knew each other, oftentimes out of the public eye. And I was allowed access at Wheaton College outside of Chicago. And what Wheaton told me was the diary also contains Graham contact with over 50 foreign heads of state, because his crusades, so many were international. I was told that one researcher ahead of me had been granted access to look at Graham's contact with the British royal family, which wasn't what I was looking for. Otherwise, I was the first person to look at it. And so I was allowed to see the 60s volumes for Johnson and Nixon. And what they show for 68 is that there's a chapter in the book called Messenger, and that's really what Graham was. I think Graham deeply loved Lyndon Johnson, and if Johnson had run, it would have presented an enormous test of loyalties, either Johnson or for Nixon. Graham had actually told Nixon that he didn't think Johnson was going to run again. Nixon didn't believe him. And I guess any of us would think, anyone who worked so hard to acquire political power, wouldn't give it up voluntarily until they really had to. So Graham acts as a messenger. Johnson, Nixon, even former President Eisenhower, California Governor Reagan, making sure he wasn't going to jump in the race and divide the conservative vote. He knew Hubert Humphrey. He knew all the major figures. George Wallace, I think I estimated an average 20 years at that point in late 60s, because Graham was reaching the peak of his career just as they were around the same time in politics. And so the messages go back and forth, and they're fascinating. And this back and forth activity really peaks around Labor Day, which is kind of usually the kickoff of the high part of the campaign, at least back then. Now campaigns never end. But back then, they kind of start in the fall after Labor Day. And Graham carries a message from Nixon to Johnson. And the message says that as president, it's a bold thing to say if you think about it. This is September of 68, 3 months before people go to the polls, 2 months, 3 months. As president, Nixon would never embarrass Johnson. He would always consult with him. He would never criticize him by name. When Vietnam is over, he would give him credit because he deserved it for ending the war, and that Nixon would do everything in his power to give Johnson a great place in history. It's a stunning thing to think about. A presidential aspirant to the most powerful politician, a little damaged, a little wounded, an incredible act, I would say, of political marksmanship. I mean, imagine if it had leaked out. I mean, Nixon had effectively handed Johnson all the cards he could have needed to blow up the Nixon campaign at that point. I mean, if Johnson wasn't along for what I argue in the book, that was his moment to stop it all. So it's incredible. It's just one of the messages, that are in the book. And the role that Graham played was really unique in American history.
So does that moderate how Johnson acted throughout the duration of the campaign?
Well, Johnson doesn't criticize Nixon. And Nixon doesn't criticize Johnson. I think some of Nixon's more, both Johnson and Nixon had some more younger political partisan staffers. And I remember Bill Safire's book was really good about this period in history. And I believe Safire says something like, Johnson's instructing the young speechwriting staff, I know it's awkward, but don't criticize Johnson. He's had it hard, he suffered. And so it was this kind of thing. Safire sets up this image that you can imagine. I think he calls it, the Johnson and Nixon relationship was sort of like, it's like a cockfight between sort of two roosters with sort of knives attached to their spurs. And they're circling each other, they never take the eyes off the other. But as long as the one doesn't strike, then no one gets bloodied. And I think that sort of sets up the idea, of the Johnson-Nixon relationship. I'm careful. I wouldn't say they were friends, but they were friendly. I wouldn't say that Johnson supported Nixon. I would say he came to prefer him. And so it's nuanced. I mean, these were longtime rivals, who ended the careers of many of each other's friends over many decades. But I think they came to see that they needed each other.
So we're at the Nixon Library. We have to, let's talk about former Vice President Nixon in the 1960s. He lost the presidency in 1960. He lost a run for California governor in 1962. And yet, through a meticulously disciplined strategy, and not to mention his own sheer will and his own determination, he wins every Republican primary in 1968 and becomes the nominee. It's one of the greatest comebacks. His one-time aide, Pat Buchanan, wrote a book about the 68 election called The Greatest Comeback. What was Nixon running on, and why did voters flock to him in 1968?
It's a great question, and I spent some time, in the book on the four major characters, Johnson, Humphrey, Nixon, Wallace, kind of describing not just what they were doing during 68, but in the years leading up to 68, kind of how they established themselves by 68, how they began their campaigns. And I think Pat Buchanan's book says, people said Nixon was a loser after losing narrowly in 60 to Kennedy and Johnson, after losing more decisively for the California governorship in 62. And he said, and I think Nixon thought he was a loser. I mean, the media celebrated, the political obituary of Richard Nixon, ABC. And I think Nixon really did break from politics. And when you move cross-country to New York City, you pull up those roots, you've got no political career to go back to. I think the New York Republicans in the 60s didn't consider Nixon to be one of their own. I don't think Jacob Javits or Nelson Rockefeller invited Nixon to any Republican events in New York City till about 1967, and he'd been there practicing law since 63. So I think Nixon really thought his political career was over, and he was surprised by how much he missed the arena, missed politics. And for the first time in his career, he had time to study. He said, I never had time to read for 8 years as Eisenhower's vice president. I think he really must have spent a lot of time soul-searching and figuring out what he did wrong. I think he pushed even more toward the center lane of the Republican Party. I think when he came back in 68, he was more thoughtful. I think he was less hurried. I think he was much wiser about his approach to politics. And you compare nowadays you can go on YouTube and find all kinds of videos from 60 and 68. 68, there's just something different about him. He's more mature. But 60, he was a young man. I mean, he was still 47. And people like Billy Graham thought he would have another chance. He was young enough that he would have another chance in a few more years to run again. The cycles of government, parties often change every 4, 8, sometimes 12 years. Nixon still could do it again. And when he came back in 68, I think he was much more mature, calculated. I think he understood how to, in 60, if he was defeated by media, perhaps the sound bites of the 60 debates, in 68, he used media to win. I mean, really that kind of thing. He really learned from his own mistakes. That takes, I don't know about you, but it's tough to learn from your mistakes and really figure out what you do wrong. I think Nixon really did that. It was a difficult process by 68. And people at the time wrote that he was perhaps a new Nixon. I think the whole country had been through an awful lot in the 1960s, the turbulence, the war. And so I think when he came back in 68, I think he was an alternative for a lot of Americans because he was a way to escape the chaos of that decade. I think both parties, if they agree on one thing in 1968, it's turning the noise level down, at home and abroad. That's certainly a theme here, in the revised galleries, that first one you walk through of all the things that were going on in the 1960s to kind of take you back to that time period. And so Nixon was a way, almost like a time machine for voters, where you could choose someone whose own political career and rise wasn't tied to the chaos of the decade. He wasn't tied to the war. He wasn't tied to the unrest in the nation. And he was a way, in a sense, to bring some more normalcy and sanity to the country.
There's another player in this mix. You've mentioned his name a few times tonight, Alabama Governor George Wallace. You spent time with Wallace's associates and family, and you dug into the Wallace papers. Was Wallace a spoiler, or did he really believe that he had a shot?
I think Wallace, in a way, is the most fascinating person in the whole campaign. He really was the wild card. And what I mean by that is, you know, as Americans, we don't see this very often in politics. And by that, a third-party candidate who's popular enough to potentially make a difference in the outcome. And I don't know about you, but usually when I vote, I see kind of the tops of the tickets, and then usually, for at least for a moment, kind of scan down the ballot to the other candidates. And a lot of times I see parties and candidates I haven't heard of before. And maybe it'll be the same next year when we vote. Wallace was the one that was different. He got on the ballot in all 50 states. He ran as a third-party challenger because even though he was a longtime Southern Democrat, kind of a Southern populist FDR New Deal Democrat, he wanted to be free to be able to criticize both parties. So he ran as a third-party candidate. I sometimes joke, but I think it's true. You know, there's probably very little in Washington today that brings the parties together across the aisle. Maybe concern of China, concern about social media, maybe today concern about AI, but also getting rid of third-party challenges. I mean, if you try to enter a state as a third-party candidate, you not only have to navigate all the legal hurdles to get on the ballot, but the challenges from both parties. You know, some of the states, Ohio and California were two of the hardest ones. California, I believe you had to collect the number of signatures, and it was almost a year before the election, a very long lead time, when campaigns often at that point aren't even really announced for several more months. And I think in California you need not just the signatures, but every person who signed also had to complete a 2-page application for membership in what was then called the American Independent Party. An incredible hurdle, you know, to become a third-party challenge. And now with no labels and all this, people are trying to figure out a way to get on the ballot next year. Wallace figured out how to do that. And if you're a third-party candidate, you're the one to watch if you can pull that off. But more importantly, I would say, what I take away from Wallace, it was really the first full 50-state campaign to be anti-elite, anti-media, anti-establishment, and probably all populists on both sides of the aisle, more recently on the Republican side because of Donald Trump, I would argue borrowed from the Wallace playbook. Those are the themes. Lyndon Johnson is the last president to win the blue-collar, lower-middle-class vote, traditional Democrat voters, a huge part of the FDR New Deal constituency. He's the last one to win them as a voting bloc in 1964, and their votes have been up for grab ever since. It's incredible. And now a populist Republican billionaire has made deeper inroads into that traditional Democratic base than any other politician since. The phrase drain the swamp never occurred to George Wallace, but I think if it did, he would have used it because that was very much kind of part of his ethos in 1968.
So in the final days before the election, Humphrey is surging. And it has been written in popular history that this was due to a sordid scheme that was supposedly initiated by the Nixon campaign to play on racial fears in the South, known as the Southern Strategy. But you attribute this surge in the final days by Humphrey to something else entirely. What is that?
Well, and here again, I'm quoting from Humphrey records. So my take on this is different than most other things, like most other things in the book. I've been in touch with Humphrey's political strategist, Vic Fingerhut, who mainly works in kind of labor campaigns, Democratic campaigns. He's still around today, getting ready for 2024. And he said, this is all nonsense. He said, the way every history book says is that either because of the Chenault Affair or it was Humphrey separating himself from Lyndon Johnson on the issue of Vietnam. He gave a big speech in September 30th in Salt Lake City, the Salt Lake City speech. You can Google Salt Lake City speech, and it'll be Hubert Humphrey, 1968. And he says it's not true. And if anyone had asked me, I would have told him. He's like, it was the second week of October, and I wrote a memo. He provided the documentation to me, to Humphrey, that you're going to lose. If you stay on the path that you're on right now, you're going to lose in 3 weeks. How do you want to turn it around? Here's a way to do it. Look at Truman in 1948. He switched back. First of all, he said, concede Vietnam and all the foreign policy to the Republicans. It's a traditional strength to them in 68. Stop talking about Vietnam, because every time you talk about Vietnam, it's a reminder of the party that was in charge during Vietnam. Just stop talking about it. Secondly, return to favorable issues for Democrats. What Fingerhut said to me was, in every campaign, like now, people are emotional in the early polls, and then they get serious in the weeks leading up, and they figure, okay, how am I really going to vote? And in the trade, those are called the late switchers. And he said the late switchers in 68, he said 8 out of 10 votes that transferred from Wallace, the racist, so-called, came back to Humphrey. Makes no sense politically to go from the pro-Vietnam, racist candidate, segregationist, back over to Humphrey. He said it was all because of the union getting out the vote, and Humphrey switched back to the message of traditional democratic prosperity, jobs, the economy, education, Social Security. That he said the strategy for Humphrey should be to remind voters, traditional Democratic voters, of, even though things were bad in 68, remind them what Democrats had historically done for voters, FDR, Truman, and others on these issues. And he said that was the reason it ended up being so close. And if he had a little bit more time, and he started that switch earlier in the campaign, it might have got him across the finish line. So it's just one more example of people no one had ever talked to, records that no one had ever looked at. And so even for a subject that you feel you know so much about already, how could we possibly learn anything else about a subject like 1968? It shows that we have an awful lot to learn still. And I would argue even with this book, we're going to learn more about this year. I did my best, but there are still questions that I couldn't answer. I think future generations of researchers will go even further.
You've taught us a lot in the year that broke politics, and we do have time for a few questions tonight. My colleague Chris will come around to you. If you have a question, please raise your hand.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. Here. Thank you. Let's give him a round of applause. And our first question.
Luke, first let me commend and congratulate you. I was in college in '68. For almost 2 years, I was one of the editors of our campus newspaper. So summer of '68, Bobby Kennedy had a very huge following among the young college students. I guess my question would be, had Bobby Kennedy not been assassinated, what's your take on how that election might have gone in '68?
It's a great question.
It is a great question. And of course, I should say, historians, of course, don't deal with what ifs, and we don't like counterfactuals, but we're fascinated by them, just as everyone is. I think I would answer it two ways. There's no doubt that after losing the Oregon primary in '68, it was the first time a Kennedy had ever lost an election. I think up to that point, they were 24 for 24. And then winning the California primary, there's no question that Senator Kennedy was surging at the moment that he was struck down. And so no one really knows where that could have led, to the convention. No question about that. On the other hand, I would also say there's a lot of evidence against the idea. There's a lot of people who lived through that time period who are still very committed to one side or the other, and it's not necessarily things that you'll find in archives or can prove. And the rules were different for the Democrats back then. It wasn't until 1972 that the McGovern Convention really modernized the way that candidates are chosen, the way the convention works. In 1968, if you're running as a Democrat, you don't need to enter any primaries. They're not really binding on anything. Hubert Humphrey didn't enter any primaries. You've got most of the delegates wrapped up already. Virtually all of the state and county chairmen from coast to coast owed the Johnson-Humphrey administration loyalty in '68. And when Johnson didn't run, remember, it was a surprise to them too. Humphrey automatically inherited the vast majority of that support. There would have been some rebels, no doubt, in Chicago, and it would have made a pretty interesting convention. Had McCarthy really lived up, the other challenger, to what he stood for initially, and had Kennedy made it all the way. Some people say, well, what could Humphrey have done differently to win? Put John Connally on the ticket and divide the conservative vote that otherwise went to Wallace or Nixon, would have made it really interesting. So it's possible, and certainly he was surging when Sirhan struck him down, but the system was really weighted at that time against an insurgent, like Bobby Kennedy. It would have been pretty tough to overcome because Humphrey had the vast majority of Lyndon Johnson's strength.
Right side, second row, guys.
Luke, in reference to George Wallace, was his strategy to force it into the House of Representatives and prevent Humphrey and Nixon from getting enough electoral votes?
This is interesting because if we all every 4 years we all become experts on these red and blue maps, and we're studying kind of how our candidate might have a path, however narrow, to get to the White House. And it is a possible, mathematical thing whereby both candidates can fall short of the number of electoral votes needed. And then this is the problem that we have, is that Congress ultimately becomes involved. This hasn't happened very often. It happened in 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes, who didn't win either the Electoral College or the popular vote, yet became the winner over Samuel Tilden in 1876 and ended ultimately Reconstruction and kind of helped to heal the nation after the Civil War. It doesn't happen very often. This has been written up a lot in history books, that's what Wallace's strategy really was, is to be just disruptive enough to deny a victory to either major party. And most history books have said, and likely if that had happened and the result had gone to the House of Representatives, by looking at that Democrats controlled the House and controlled more one vote would have gone to each state delegation. Democrats controlled more state delegations than did Republicans, then that would have been another way Humphrey could have won. Well, there are two reactions. That's not what the Wallace people told me. The Wallace people said we were more likely to cut a deal with Nixon. We were closer to Nixon. And if you look at the state delegations in the House, I think it was something like 27 to 23. Don't quote me, but it's some Democrats to Republicans. But then you have, I think, five of those actually went for Wallace. And then you had others that were softer. So it starts to get really interesting. And what I say in the book is there would have been incredible horse trading, that would have gone on in the House had that happened. I think it would have been pretty interesting. But ideologically, I think Wallace had more to gain by cutting a deal with the Nixon side and letting Nixon be president than going with Humphrey.
We have time for one last question, and I think it's appropriate for it to come from one of our students from Chapman University.
Always the hardest questions.
Sir, what is your question?
So I just kind of thought you brought up a lot of parallels between the 2016 and 1968 election, particularly with the candidates of George Wallace and Trump. I was wondering if you kind of thought that 1968, a lot of people are dissatisfied with the government, whatnot, and George Wallace's success. Do you think that started an anti-government reaction with people that culminated with Trump's election in 2016?
I think there are parallels you can draw from that time period to this one. I think there are other parallels that don't really work. I think history sometimes repeats, but not always. I think fundamental differences back then were the draft is a big factor. The draft was really not just a major foreign policy issue, but tearing the nation apart. The assassinations, the degree of violence that the nation experienced in 1968 is something that we don't hopefully have today or will have today. Those two assassinations in April of Dr. King and then Senator Kennedy in June, we're not quite there yet. I mean, sometimes people say, has it gotten as bad as 68? Is it worse? Those are two elements that we don't have today. But I would say in other ways that there are a lot of similarities. The anti-establishment, the anti-elite, running as a populist, running as an outsider. I think all candidates have run on that to a degree. Even Nixon's choice of Spiro Agnew in 68 as a running mate, which a lot of people kind of wonder, what was that about? What was the strategy about? This fairly unknown governor. But I think it really fits if you look at the time period. At the time, he was someone who condemned the violence. He was basically a Rockefeller Republican. He was to the left of Nixon, probably, on most issues. He was tough against the violence. As a Baltimorean, as a governor of Maryland, it fit. And he took him away from Rockefeller, who was a key rival of Nixon's. Agnew was, putting Agnew on the ticket was a little bit like taking a Wallace light anti-establishment type and bringing him onto an otherwise establishment campaign. And so even Nixon captured a piece of Wallace's magic by putting him on the ticket, because Agnew, during the presidency, went on to really talk. He almost always gave the tough anti-lead, anti-media speeches, the nattering nabobs of negativism, and all these phrases that have entered our political lexicon because of the Nixon years. So I think Nixon recognized that Wallace, while he turned a lot of people off, he also really struck a nerve with his followers. And while the national media assigned to the Wallace campaign were always talking about race and segregation, things that Wallace said much earlier in his political career, by late 60s, I would argue that Wallace's political message was much more sophisticated, much more class-based than race-based. And race was there, but it was really folded into a broader set of grievances that begin to look like Donald Trump's grievances.
The book is The Year That Broke Politics, Collusion and Chaos in the Presidential Election of 1968. Thank you, Dr. Luke Nichter, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Have a good evening. Good night.